Is the world something like a machine, or is it something like an organism? Is it fundamentally dead or fundamentally alive? Is it a sum of smaller replaceable parts, or is it a synergetic whole of interconnected systems? Can it be dissected, analyzed, and controlled to achieve our ends, or does its sheer complexity preclude any real understanding and control? The great social and cultural significance of the scientific revolution of the 17th century was to initiate a decisive shift in the perception of the universe from an organism to a mechanism, with the machine serving as the ideal metaphor of the latter. Not only did the machine metaphor slowly eclipse the organicist thinking of the Renaissance in Europe, as Caroline Merchant describes in her landmark work, The Death of Nature, but it also swept aside to a great extent the organic worldviews of non-European people when the Europeans showed up at their shores with superior weapons and industrial goods, the technological products of the scientific revolution. Today, the machine model is implicit in how we view the world and interact with it. Whether we are liberal or conservative, capitalist or socialist, religious or non-believers, all of us middle-class educated folks with big jobs and fancy opinions are, at some level at least, Newtonians. Merchant writes, "The world in which we live today was bequeathed to us by Isaac Newton. Classical physics and its philosophy structure our consciousness to believe in a world composed of atomic parts, of inert bodies moving with uniform velocity unless forced by another body to deviate from their straight line paths, of objects seen by reflected light of varying frequencies, and of matter in motion, responsible for all the rich variations in colors, sounds, smells, tastes, and touches we cherish as human beings. In our daily lives, most of us accept these teachings as givens without much critical reflection on their origins or associated values." My attempt in this video is of course not to refute the Newtonian understanding of reality. Rather, I'm going to start with a much more humble goal, that is, to address the lack of critical reflection on the origins of the scientific revolution that Merchant mentions. To do that, we need to examine certain assumptions that serve as the foundation for the edifice of classical physics, beginning with assumptions about what actually exists in the world. Such an examination will hopefully illustrate that far from adhering to a universal, trans-historical standard of objectivity, these assumptions sprang up from specific ideas, debates, and concerns of the historical period over which they were formulated, and were deeply colored by the peculiar notions, preferences, and eccentricities of the men who formulated them. One such gentleman was the philosopher René Descartes, the cogito ergo sum guy, whose life's project was to find a criteria for certain knowledge of the world. Descartes and his contemporaries' search for certainty had as its background the erosion of intellectual authority triggered by the Protestant Reformation. In the 1500s, Martin Luther's challenge to the Catholic Church's monopoly on determining religious truth precipitated a far-reaching skepticism about all received wisdom in Western Europe. Luther's search for criteria in religious truth, according to Merchant, was applied to all natural knowledge by the skeptics of the late 16th century. In this climate of doubt and speculation, Descartes and his contemporaries in France articulated a mechanistic philosophy in the first half of the 17th century, which they believed provided a sure basis for revealing the secret laws of nature. Central to this philosophy was the idea or assumption that the fundamental unit of reality is tiny bits of dead matter. Now, Descartes and his buddies weren't the first to come up with the general idea. Atomism, the theory that all matter is made up of small indivisible particles which combine to produce visible objects and phenomena, has existed for thousands of years in several cultures. Descartes and his contemporaries were particularly influenced by Epicurus and Lucretius and modified their ancient Greek atomism to fit into the new mechanical philosophy. By reviving atomism and stressing matter's passivity, Descartes went on to explain motion in purely mechanistic terms. Motion occurred only when an external force was applied to particles or corpuscles, which then transferred motion to the next corpuscle, and so on. In doing so, he challenged the prevailing Aristotelian orthodoxy of his day, which explained the motion of bodies as an interplay between physical matter and a non-physical entity inherent in each individual body called its form. Now, the nature of forms in Aristotelian thought is an extremely complicated matter, but for Descartes, these forms were like little souls joined to their bodies, which he felt accorded a kind of intentionality or thought to matter. Water flows down in the Aristotelian view not because of forces pulling it down, but due to its unique form pushing it towards the center of the earth. The implication being that water is in some sense aware of something called the center of the earth. Now, even though the Catholic Church supported the Aristotelian view and Descartes himself was taught this at school, he eventually rejected it in favor of the mechanistic view. He did this not based on any new experimental evidence. Nobody could empirically prove at the time that matter was made up of atoms or whether forms were real or not. Nor was it a position he arrived at by pure logic. Given their respective starting assumptions, both views could coherently explain phenomena within their theoretical frameworks. And even though he offered several arguments against the Aristotelian view, they kind of fell short of his own high standards of certainty, as Daniel Garber points out in his study of Descartes' philosophy. Nor was it a dislike of immaterial supernatural things like souls as a causal explanation. Descartes was a devout Catholic who believed that the Christian God created the universe and all natural laws emanated from his supreme intellect. Rather, Descartes' preference, and it was a preference, a choice, for viewing matter as a collection of dead particles is tied to his use of mathematics as a tool to gain certain knowledge of the world. Descartes was convinced that mathematics offered the highest standard of proof. Ideas that could be expressed and broken down to mathematical formulations could be decisively proven to be true or false. Once proven, mathematical relations could be extended across the universe. The statement A equals A is true on planet Earth, on Saturn, and in the Andromeda galaxy. Further, mathematical relations provide a basis for predictability. A equals A is true today and will be so tomorrow, and so on. The lure of mathematics for Descartes' project should be obvious, and simultaneously, his reasons for rejecting the Aristotelian view of his teachers should be becoming clearer. The movement of a body influenced by a knowing immaterial form which steers it to its natural place simply cannot be described mathematically. How do you quantify something that is not physically measurable? Forms for Descartes were an impediment in describing the world mathematically, and as long as these thinking forms lurked within matter, the world could not become intelligible. To be clear, I don't mean to give the wrong impression and suggest that this was the actual reasoning Descartes followed. He didn't go, these forms are getting in the way of my mathematics, let me just get rid of them. Rather, it was the perceived inability of the Aristotelian view to furnish a firmer foundation of knowledge that Descartes and his contemporaries were after, which pushed him to break with the orthodoxy of the day. This bold intellectual leap, this rejection of thinking forms, was to have a profound influence on the development of science as we know it, for it led Descartes to formulate what is known as Cartesian dualism, the division of the world into two kinds of substances. On the one hand, we have dead, lifeless, thoughtless matter, whose essential features are its measurable physical properties like size, volume, mass, speed, etc. The entirety of the external world was like this, according to Descartes, from the celestial bodies to rocks, plants, animals, and was thus within the scope of mathematical and scientific inquiry. On the other hand, there is mind, the other kind of substance, whose essential features are thought, feeling, reason, will, intentionality, attributes which are mental, not mathematical, and hence outside the scope of science. Again, mind-body dualism has a long and storied history in all cultures, and these philosophies have argued that everything we see is some combination of mind and body. But what was radical about Descartes' version was that it asserted that mind and body are mutually exclusive, with one important exception. Thus, all of nature is mindless matter, a machine whose parts blindly follow mechanical laws laid down by God, the designer, the one who is all mind and no matter. The only meeting place of the two substances is the human body, which has both consciousness and physicality. With this division, Descartes banished all thought from nature, not just the Aristotelian forms, but all the spirits of other organic philosophies, from the world soul or world spirit which breathes life into the world, to the individual spirits inhering in animals, plants, forests, rivers, mountains, in pagan and animistic religions. Subjectivity, in the sense of being a subject who experiences things and reflects on them, was restricted to the human mind alone. The importance of Cartesian dualism cannot be overstated, for it prepared the ground for all subsequent scientific development of the early modern era. The philosopher Hans Jonas writes, "The scientific advantage of dualism was that the new mathematical ideal of natural knowledge was best served by, and indeed required, the clean-cut division between two realms which left science to deal with a pure res extensa, untainted with the non-mathematical characters of being. Here was one substance whose one essential attribute is extension, notion, whose knowledge therefore is essentially in the mode of measurement and mathematical description, and another substance entirely separate and independent, whose one essential attribute is awareness, and the appropriate mode of whose knowledge and description was indeed much less clearly stated, but also of much less concern. What mattered was its isolation from the other. The isolation of the res cogitans was the most effective way of securing the complete ontological detachment of external reality from what was not extended and measurable. Thus, besides constituting this reality as a self-contained field for the universal application of mathematical analysis, the division provided the metaphysical justification for the all-out mechanical materialism of modern science. Once these pesky, non-mathematical characters of being were gotten rid of, it was possible to claim that there was nothing in the natural world which could not be reduced to the physical interactions of tiny bits of identical matter. Thus, the mechanical worldview is committed to the notion of atomistic reductionism, which holds that explanations of larger phenomena are to be sought exclusively in events at smaller scales, and particularly in smaller and smaller bits of matter. As Alex Gomez-Marin and Juan Arnaud write in a paper on the subject, in this view, reality is like a building, and as such it is made of building blocks. The quest of the physicist and the philosopher is then to find out about those tiny building blocks, inquiring about the smallest of objects in order to identify and characterize the constituents of reality. Though challenged in his own time, atomistic reductionism has become an uncontested fact of existence 400 years after Descartes. The unfolding of reality is simply the spatio-temporal rearrangement of tiny building blocks under the influence of indifferent forces. It follows that to understand reality, then, we have to study the interactions between these discrete, localizable blocks that are out there in space-time doing their cosmic dance. This notion of solid, localizable blocks that move around in space-time is so fundamental to our current scientific understanding that it is very rarely even acknowledged as something that should be spelled out and explained. But this concept does have a name. The 20th century mathematician and philosopher Alfred North Whitehead called it simple location and considered it the very foundation of the 17th century scheme of nature. He defined simple location as, to say that a bit of matter has simple location means that in expressing its spatio-temporal relations, it is adequate to state that it is where it is in a definite finite region of space and throughout a definite finite duration of time, apart from any essential reference of the relations of that bit of matter to other regions of space and to other durations of time. Now, the first part of that quote is quite self-explanatory, but the last part needs some elaboration. Implicit in the concept of simple location is the idea that any relations a building block enters into with another block does not alter its essence. That is, it retains its identity throughout the series of relations it enters into. The electron in a hydrogen atom in a water molecule in my body is exactly identical to the electron in a hydrogen atom in the heart of the sun. The only difference is where they are physically located in space-time at this instant. The history of those two electrons, how one ended up in me and the other in the sun, and all the previous relations each of them entered into, does not influence their essence one bit, which remains identical. With that in mind, we turn to Gomez-Marin and Arnaud for a more straightforward definition of simple location. Simple location is the notion that there are portions of matter that are fully describable apart from any reference to any other portions of matter, so that any relation to other entities, existing or not, is secondary. Relations thus cannot really say anything about the internal constitution of a bit of matter. At this point, I expect you'll be wondering, why is this guy spending so much time defining such a basic, trivial idea? And I agree, it seems very trivial indeed as long as we're in the realm of classical physics dealing with macroscopic objects. But here's the thing, as soon as we descend to the quantum level, it becomes quite tricky to hold on to the notion of simple location. Now, I don't pretend to know much about quantum physics, and I would definitely be skeptical of anything a random person on YouTube is saying about quantum physics, but in my limited understanding, I don't think it is controversial to say that the idea of simple location has taken quite a beating due to our exploration of the quantum realm and its inescapable uncertainties. Instead of being able to precisely pinpoint the location of an electron in space-time, we can only talk probabilistically about where it might be. In fact, at the quantum level, matter seems to lose its realness, its supposed solidity and fixed boundaries, and dissolves into waves. And waves are not solid entities. They are perturbations in a field, and the fields are everywhere. As Gomez-Marin and Arnaud write, the intellectual boldness of physicists taught us that when you get to the smallest bits, not only doesn't the universe look like a uniform pile of bricks, but that such a zoo of particles within exotic families, quarks, leptons, gauge bosons, etc., are not localizable or distinguishable from the field in which they move and from which they appear and disappear. Already being way out of my depth here, I have no intention of exploring the scientific and philosophical repercussions of quantum physics, but by indicating how tenuous it is at the smallest scales, my purpose is to illustrate that the idea of simple location is not, as we like to think, an objective description of reality, but is instead an abstraction we create mentally to try and map the world in atomistic terms. And moreover, as Whitehead contends, this confusion between reality and abstraction creates a huge mess in how we think about the world. Now, I know all of that sounds a bit out there, but please bear with me as this is an extremely important point. What do I mean when I say simple location is an abstraction? Well, all I'm saying is that we don't experience reality as an aggregate of infinitesimally small particles. For example, when you swim in the sea, your experience is not of being surrounded by billions of disconnected tiny water droplets. Your experience is of the sea as a whole. By a process of mental abstraction, we can say that yes, the sea is made up of billions of droplets, but the droplets and all the individual water molecules in those droplets, they do not enter into your immediate experience. Similarly, the simply located particle is conceived in the mind by mentally abstracting from our messy, complex experience of reality. As James Clerk Maxwell, the famous Scottish physicist, put it, we are accustomed to consider the universe as made of parts, and mathematicians usually begin by considering a single particle and conceiving its relation to another particle, and so on. To conceive a particle requires a process of abstraction, since all our perceptions are related to extended bodies. Once the simply located particle is abstracted from reality, another round of abstraction follows, in which we strip the particle of its history of relations and posit that they are inessential to understanding its behavior. For example, when we think of a person who has been convicted of a crime, we tend to use the label convict indiscriminately, as if that person is just a convict and nothing else. We abstract away from all the other labels we could attach to this person, a father, an accountant, a left-handed batsman, etc., and consider the label convict to be the sole description of their personhood. Similarly, by a process of abstraction, we say that the only thing that matters in defining the particle is its spatio-temporal location and nothing else. On this abstract plane, classical physics set about explaining the world, and it achieved an astonishing amount of success in this regard. But here's the problem. The success itself served to induce an almost universal forgetfulness about the fact that we are working with abstractions, and that abstractions are by their very nature simplifications of aspects of an extremely complex reality. Whether it is the frictionless planes and pulleys we learn of in school when we're studying Newtonian mechanics, or a diagram of an organism's reproductive system, or even national borders. These are all abstractions we invent for their explanatory powers. They help us focus our attention on certain things we're interested in and ignore others. They help us categorize things. They help us make a map of the world out of the constant chaotic stream of inputs we get through our senses. But the trouble arises when we forget we're working with abstractions, no matter how useful or successful they are, and think that the world actually exists as described by our abstractions. Then we commit the classic error of mistaking the map for the territory. The shock of the 20th century quantum revolution was that the abstractions of classical physics, and not just any abstraction, but the most fundamental abstraction, that is simple location, didn't apply anymore. Our maps didn't work. It doesn't mean that we were wrong to make abstractions, nor does it mean that the explanations we formed using them are completely wrong. Rather, the problem is that we forget that outside of their usefulness in particular situations, abstractions are not a precise description of concrete reality. As Gomez-Marin and Arnaud write, the problem with simple location is not just a simply attributed location by itself. It is that we take such an abstraction as concrete. In other words, the error is to conflate abstraction with reality, what Whitehead called the fallacy of misplaced concreteness. As I hinted earlier, the fallacy of misplaced concreteness is a source of great confusion in how we think about the world. Because we mistake the abstract for the concrete, we forget that what our explanations and models capture is not all of reality, but a certain aspect of reality. This is what I meant in the beginning when I said that we're all Newtonians today. I didn't just mean that we all believe the Newtonian view of reality is correct, but rather we believe that the Newtonian view of reality is the only one which is correct. We confuse a partial view of the world that our abstractions provide with a total view of the world. The only thing that matters, we say, is atoms and their collisions. Please note that I am not denying the reality of atoms and electrons and suggesting that they're purely mental constructions. Abstractions can only be useful if they have some relation to reality. And though no one has ever seen an atom, much less an electron, there is empirical evidence that entities which have the characteristics we associate with atoms and electrons do exist. That reality is atomic is not being disputed. It was as obvious to people living thousands of years ago as it is to a child playing with Lego blocks today that you can assemble small things to make bigger things. That much we can ascertain from our day-to-day experience. But to say that all causal explanations are to be found at the level of atoms, to insist that all reality is only atoms and their accidental collisions and nothing else, that is being disputed. As Čapek argues in his paper on simple location, atomicity is only one aspect of nature. The dynamic connection of each individual entity with the rest of the universe is another equally essential aspect of reality which cannot be ignored. The exclusive focus on the mechanical interactions of tiny bits of matter has yielded tremendous scientific and technological gifts. But in its exclusion of the dynamic, relational aspect of the world, it has led us to ignore and devalue the evidence our experience provides in judging what reality is. For example, if we do live in a purely mechanical universe, then the richness and variety of human experience, all the colors, sounds, smells, patterns we discern in the external world, and the feelings they elicit in us are in a profound sense illusory. For there is nothing in the external world apart from the physical movement of simply located particles that are merely rearranging themselves spatio-temporally. Photons from the sun are reflected off a cloud, fall on my retina and excite the optic nerve, which then transmits electrical impulses to my brain, wherein this whole series of physical disturbances is translated to an image, and I see the cloud is pink in color. But the color pink is not found anywhere outside my mind. Externally, there is just a chain of physical disturbances, and it is only in my mind that a certain kind of subatomic disturbance is associated with the subjective experience of the color pink. Whitehead explains this as follows. The occurrences of nature are in some way apprehended by minds which are associated with living bodies. Primarily, the mental apprehension is aroused by the occurrences in the brain. But the mind in apprehending also experiences sensations which, properly speaking, are qualities of the mind alone. These sensations are projected by the mind so as to clothe appropriate bodies in external nature. Thus, the bodies are perceived as with qualities which in reality do not belong to them, qualities which in fact are purely the offspring of the mind. Thus, nature gets credit which should in truth be reserved for ourselves, the rose for its scent, the nightingale for his song, and the sun for his radiance. The poets are entirely mistaken. They should address their lyrics to themselves and should turn them into odes of self-congratulation on the excellency of the human mind. Nature is a dull affair, soundless, scentless, colorless, merely the hurrying of material, endlessly, meaninglessly. However you disguise it, this is the practical outcome of the characteristic scientific philosophy which closed the 17th century. For a hard-headed materialist, any protest against the idea that nature is merely the meaningless hurrying of material is rooted in a naive romanticism. It is seen as an inability to accept the cold, hard facts about the world. For Whitehead, though, the materialist is so thoroughly wrapped up in their abstractions that they ignore all the evidence our senses and intuition are giving us of the essential interconnectedness of reality. When you're standing by the sea, watching the sun go down, you see the riot of colors in the sky, you hear the deep rumble and crashing of the waves, you feel the sea breeze in your face. When all of that comes together with your own history, everything that led you to that moment, then you feel awe, you feel reverence, you feel vast and insignificant at the same time. That is not an illusion. That is your concrete experience telling you something. It is whispering in your ear that underneath the dazzling variety of things, there is a profound unity. Apart from a few unfortunate and impoverished souls, everyone has had similar experiences, and yet this properly empirical evidence is considered to be completely inadmissible in forming our ideas about what the world is. A radical empiricism in the flavor of American philosopher William James would argue that what our experience is telling us is as real and as important as the hard and fast collisions of subatomic particles. When we cut out everything else outside the scope of our abstractions, we are bound to be led astray, as Whitehead writes. The disadvantage of exclusive attention to a group of abstractions, however well-founded, is that you have abstracted from the remainder of things. Insofar as the excluded things are important in your experience, your modes of thought are not fitted to deal with them. You cannot think without abstractions. Accordingly, it is of the utmost importance to be vigilant in critically revising your modes of abstraction. such vigilance as Whitehead expects has largely been missing. And 100 years on from the quantum revolution, we seem to be extremely reluctant in revising our modes of abstraction. This unscientific attitude is ironically responsible for one of the most potent myths that characterize our time, that of the scientific project embodying the dispassionate study of objective fact and of its conclusions conforming to the highest standard of knowledge, untainted by biases and metaphysical ideas. Correspondingly, all modes of thought that do not follow its doctrines and methodology, that harbor ideas about things beyond the physical, are dismissed as irrational, having nothing in them that could supplement our scientific understanding of the world. There are a couple of problems with this myth. First, despite its remarkable achievements, the greatest challenge to the validity of the mechanical worldview has come from within the sciences itself. At the start of the 19th century, the French mathematician Pierre Laplace found it reasonable to posit that a superhuman intelligence that had a knowledge of the positions and momenta of all particles in the universe at a single instant could invoke Newtonian-like dynamics to predict all future events and or hindcast all of history. Laplace's demon, as this superhuman entity was later called, is a symbol of the mechanical worldview in its moment of greatest exaltation. As the ecologist Robert Ulanovich writes, at the time of Laplace there was great optimism that we could grasp reality, and that reality was decidedly mechanical in a sense. Anything else had to be illusory because it always could be disassembled into fundamental parts that operated in a fixed, lawful manner. 200 years later, thankfully, no one seriously believes that we live in the rigidly deterministic world that people like Laplace imagined. 20th century developments within science, not just in quantum physics as discussed above, but also in irreversible thermodynamics, systems theory, process ecology, cybernetics, chaos theory, information theory, Gestalt psychology, and many more, have shattered the rigid world of 19th century mechanists by introducing elements of chance, context dependence, irreversibility, feedbacks, emergence, etc. into the language of modern science. The past century, writes Ulanovich, has taught us a little more humility concerning our ability to perceive reality directly. There always remains a veil that separates our models of the world from reality itself. However, this humility, this mellowing out of a mechanistic zeal, has not led to a far-reaching reappraisal of the fundamental assumptions of the Newtonian framework. For though the Newtonian worldview is in tatters, Ulanovich argues, most of us by and large cling to some dangling threads of the Newtonian worldview. The tendency within the sciences, according to Ulanovich, has been to accommodate and reconcile some of the messy elements introduced in the last century into the Newtonian framework while ignoring others so as to maintain the status quo. A comprehensive, critical revision of the abstractions and accompanying assumptions of the Newtonian worldview, which incorporates recent scientific developments, is long overdue. Now, the second problem with the myth of absolute scientific objectivity is that it erases the context in which the scientific project developed historically and continues to function today. What we call science is not just a collection of disconnected individuals churning out descriptive statements about the nature of reality. It is above all a social institution with its own evolving values, assumptions, priorities, all of which impinge upon individual scientists and shape their ideas and activities. The role that the socio-historical context plays in the creation and dissemination of scientific knowledge is difficult to ignore. Discussing the historical process by which modern scientific paradigms developed, Thomas Kern writes in his Structure of Scientific Revolutions, the early developmental stages of most sciences have been characterized by continual competition between a number of distinct views of nature, each partially derived from and all roughly compatible with the dictates of scientific observation and method. What differentiated these various schools was not one or another failure of method. They were all scientific, but what we shall come to call their incommensurable ways of seeing the world and of practicing science in it. Observation and experience can and must drastically restrict the range of admissible scientific belief, else there would be no science. But they cannot alone determine a particular body of such belief. An apparently arbitrary element, compounded of personal and historical accident, is always a formative ingredient of the beliefs espoused by a given scientific community at a given time. Kern's point isn't that scientists are fudging numbers to bring them in line with their personal beliefs and theories of the world. Preventing that is one of the institutional strengths of the scientific project, and it should be appreciated. Rather, his point is that there is always a personal and socio-historical context which influences the choices any scientist makes. What numbers they choose to measure, what facts they choose to look at, how they go about looking for them, what technology is available to them to conduct experiments, do they have access to institutional assistance and patronage, who is sponsoring their research, what are the results they're expecting, and so on. It is hardly controversial, in my opinion, to suggest that all those factors have some bearing on the truths scientists generate and how they interpret them. For every quantity you choose to measure, for every theory that fits the facts, you also discard something else. When you choose one thing, you also not choose everything else. That excluded section of reality doesn't just go away because we decide to not give it importance. They may, in fact, be very important, and our social conditioning could be preventing us from grasping their importance. If we forget that, as I think we do when we insist that scientific facts have nothing to do with subjective values and experience, we once again confuse a partial view of the world with a total view of the world. It's not that the facts scientists generate are wrong per se, it's just that they're not the whole picture. This is not a trivial matter. The costs of being transfixed by a partial view of reality can be very high. Kern's focus in his classic work is exclusively directed at the physical sciences, but evolutionary theory also provides an instructive example to illustrate the point. As Gregory Mengel documents in his essay Re-enchanting Evolution, the metaphors and terminology Darwin and his followers used to espouse their theory were, at least partly, intended to counter the Victorian tendency to romanticize the natural world as a perfectly harmonious creation of a beneficent God. Mengel writes, early proponents of Darwinism responded directly to the romantic idealization of nature with what they considered to be a more realistic outlook. They frequently cited examples of nature's pointless brutality and suffering. The emphasis on nature's ruthlessness is evident in the deployment of Darwinian metaphors such as survival of the fittest and the struggle for existence. This attitude towards nature became a touchstone, and evolutionary discourse since Darwin is replete with metaphors of war, struggle, competition, and selfishness, while metaphors that suggest cooperation and mutual flourishing are often treated with suspicion. A notable exception to this attitude towards nature was, of course, the geographer Pyotr Kropotkin. In 1902, he published a collection of essays titled Mutual Aid, a Factor of Evolution, in which he pointed out that one could very easily find a wealth of evidence for the importance of cooperation in the natural world, and along with competition, it too should be considered a significant factor in the evolution of species. We see here how social context plays a key role in shaping our ideas of what the world is, how values and facts are in some cases intimately linked. Social Darwinists like Herbert Spencer and T.H. Huxley tended to focus exclusively on the competitive aspect, whereas Kropotkin, being an anarchist, focused on the neglected aspect of cooperation. The issue is not that there is no competition in nature, nobody is denying its existence. The issue is that if you want to see the world as a Hobbesian war of all against all, you will find plenty of facts to support your view. And when you elevate this partial view to the level of a general principle governing all of life, people can find all sorts of other facts to scientifically justify aggression against and domination of other people. Look at nature, they say. The strong survive and the weak perish. So one can justify imperialism, racism, Nazi eugenics, and more by appealing to what we think the natural world is. Similarly, when we elevate the mechanical worldview to the only correct worldview, when we think that the world is just a vast machine consisting of interchangeable parts, we are able to justify the domination and destruction of the non-human environment. This is the relevance of this entire discussion to the question of ecology. If you think the world is dead, that there is no value or subjectivity in nature, that the relations between things are unimportant, then you will end up committing ecocide, as we have. If we want any chance of surviving the ecological catastrophe we've unleashed, I feel we have to stop thinking of the mechanical worldview as the only way of conceiving and understanding the world. This will involve not just updating the mechanical worldview with the latest scientific understanding, but also widening our understanding of the world with other perspectives. That the world we see around us in its mesmerizing totality, teeming with all kinds of strange and wonderful life, including ourselves, that this world is in some sense alive, that it is nurtured and guided by a knowing mind, of which spirits and natural deities are representations. This is a common belief among organic philosophies across cultures. Now, I'm not suggesting that we bring back ancient myths and primordial gods. I'm simply suggesting that maybe there's something to learn from them. Myths which confer subjectivity and agency upon the natural world function as powerful social mechanisms to regulate behavior. If you think the earth is a living mother, that image has an effect on how you perceive and act in the world. One does not readily slay a mother, dig into her entrails for gold, or mutilate her body, Carolyn Merchant writes. As long as the earth was conceptualized as alive and sensitive, it could be considered a breach of human ethical behavior to carry out destructive acts against it. An ethic of care, fraternity, nurturing, and reciprocity thus emerges out of such myth-making. We can look down upon this myth-making making as childish and irrational, or we can appreciate its underlying holistic logic and its quite rational, sensitive ethics. If we do the former, we can continue down our ecologically destructive path. But in that case, let's not delude ourselves into thinking that we have rid ourselves of irrational behavior. We worship the deities of state and free market. We take it as received wisdom that eternal growth is feasible and technology will solve all our problems. That's one option. Or we can supplement our scientific understanding with an outlook that views the natural world as fundamentally alive. The idea is not to bring back the old myths and superstitions or indulge in make-believe just because something is ecologically beneficial. The idea is to conjure up new metaphors, new interpretations, new abstractions, so we can look at the world as fundamentally alive, aware, sensitive, and a part of us. This task is a tough one, but certainly not impossible. As a final example, we return to where we started, to Cartesian dualism, the foundational split between mind and body that opened the field for the entire scientific project. For Descartes, the simple explanation of the human mind is that it is a gift from God. It is the thing that is unique to humans, and it is totally absent from everything else we see around us, so of course it must be something foreign, introduced into us, the chosen ones, from above. It sure as hell did not crop up from dead matter, from pure res extensa, which under the Cartesian scheme has only physical, not mental properties. Now that seemed like a reasonable belief until about the time Darwinian evolution came around and showed that we don't have to look to the heavens for an explanation of the human mind. Instead, the answer actually lies below. It showed that the human mind in all its complexity and subtlety can emerge out of the interaction of seemingly dead matter over a long period of evolution. Thus, evolutionism, Hans Jonas remarks, undid Descartes' work more effectively than any metaphysical critique. This reversal of the cosmic order, so to speak, to look to the simple for an explanation of the complex, destroyed Cartesian dualism, and with it, any conception of the human mind as something distinct from res extensa or dead matter. When this division of the universe into two substances fell apart, res extensa invaded even the complexity of the human mind, which Descartes had so carefully guarded. It then became possible to suggest that even our mind is just a particularly fancy, sophisticated assortment of dead matter. It led us to believe that our consciousness, our ability to think, create, love, hate, all our joys and passions are ultimately epiphenomenal, that is, accidental byproducts of the fancy configuration of dead matter in our heads. But that was not the only choice available. As Jonas points out, evolutionary theory could have been interpreted quite differently and actually in the completely opposite way. A powerful corollary of the emergence of the human mind through a long history of evolution is that consciousness is not a 0-1 type thing. Either God wills it and it is there, or it's totally absent. Rather, it can be seen as a graded phenomenon, evolving through countless intermediate stages into its most developed form in us. Hans Jonas writes, the continuity of descent established between humans and the animal world made it impossible any longer to regard the mind as the abrupt ingression of an ontologically foreign principle, that is God, at just this point of the total flow. For if it was no longer possible to regard the mind as discontinuous with pre-human biological history, then by the same token, no excuse was left for denying mind in proportionate degrees to the closer or remoter ancestral forms. The highest could have been reached from the lowest only through all intermediary stages. Where then, throughout the enormous extent of this series, can we draw with reason a line with the nothing of inwardness on its far side and the incipient one of it on the near side? Where else than at the beginning of life can the beginning of inwardness be placed? Thus, the theory of evolution has the potential to provide a scientific basis for conferring subjectivity, at least in degrees, to the natural world. But such an interpretation of evolution ran counter to the hard-headed mechanistic triumphalism of the 19th century. So, instead of using this opportunity to elevate non-human nature to our level, to see in it both mental and physical properties, we relegated our own minds to the purely physical. There is no more res cogitans, everything is res extensa. We transcended Cartesian dualism, but instead of mentalizing the body, we mechanize the mind. Of course, we're no longer living in the 19th century. We have a scientific basis to question the assumptions which people back then took for granted. As Murray Bookchin writes, we have a choice. We may choose to confine mentality strictly to the human cerebrum, as a Galileo and Descartes would have done, in which case we have committed mentality completely to the walls of our skulls. Or we may choose to include the natural history of mind and expand our vision of mind to include nature in its wholeness, a tradition that includes the era of philosophic speculation from the Hellenic to the early Renaissance. But let us not deceive ourselves that science has chosen its way on the basis of presuppositions that are stronger or more certain than those of other ways of knowing. An expanded vision of mind is of course not exclusive to the Western tradition. I don't have any way to prove this, but as far as I understand, most people throughout history probably did not think that mentality was restricted solely to their skulls. It's taken a lot of social conditioning to displace that insight and establish mechanical philosophy as the default way of looking at the world. With this shift, the influence of the mechanical worldview transcended the realm of natural philosophy from which it had emerged and changed every major aspect of our lives. In tandem with industrial capitalism, it radically changed the relationships we humans share with our environment, with each other, and with our own individual selves.
Hang my head, drown my fear, till you all just disappear. Black hole sun, won't you come and wash away the rain? Black hole sun, won't you come? Won't you come? Black hole sun, won't you come?